Hi, and welcome to the first Facebook Live event of 2019. I'm Fran Heathcote, the Acting President, and with me is our General Secretary, Mark Sawatka. Please could I ask everybody watching this evening to like and share the Facebook Live so that as many members as possible get to see what is likely to be quite a crucial discussion about our pay. We aim for this to last for about 45 minutes, and you can submit your questions regarding the pay campaign online or by email to editor@pcs.org.uk, giving your name and branch name. We will endeavour to answer as many questions in that time as we can, and I'll start by asking Mark, this Facebook Live follows on from a two-day NEC last week where we discussed the union strategy for our pay campaign this year. Can you outline for us the National Executive Committee's thinking on why we think we can win on pay this year?
Well, thanks, Fran, and good evening and Happy New Year to everybody. As you said, the NEC met last week, and I think the first thing that we really want to get across is that we think we've got a unique opportunity to make 2019 the year we actually win on pay and we arrest the pay decline that our members have suffered now for a decade or more. And the reason for that is that we uniquely face a government that is in total and utter disarray. As the NEC was meeting on that evening, the government lost a parliamentary vote by over 200 votes, the biggest defeat for a government in modern history. They're clearly in chaos. They depend on their hard-working civil servants now more than ever before. And faced with that disarray and a weak government, and given the justice of our case, that our members deserve a substantial pay rise, we think that if members get behind a campaign, if we can win a ballot with a huge turnout and a big majority, then we really do have the best chance to pressure the government to finally treat its own workforce with the fairness that they've refused to do for many, many years.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Can you tell us why the NEC is carrying out a consultation on pay at the moment?
Yes, last year people will remember that we balloted on pay. We had a massive vote for action, but unfortunately we fell just short of the new undemocratic thresholds the government imposed. So this year we're determined to ensure that we win on pay, and part of that is to consult high and wide in the union with members, with our activists and our reps, to ensure before we launch any ballot, we've asked as many people as possible their opinions on a wide-ranging set of issues on the campaign itself. And I would urge anybody watching here, if you're an ordinary member, we'll have emailed you a survey in the last few days to respond to that survey. If you're an activist or a branch rep, to ensure that you fill in the online consultation on behalf of your branch to give us your branch views. And if you can, try to attend one of 29 briefing sessions that are taking place throughout this month in the length and breadth of the country to come and discuss the campaign and put forward your branch views.
Okay, thank you. And can you tell us a bit of detail about the consultation, what it's asking?
Yeah, we're asking a variety of questions. The first one is what actual pay claim we should submit. The NEC, when it discussed it last week, believed that the pay claim should be in the region of 10%. And that's because last year we did worse than anyone else in the public sector. We'd already fallen way behind, and we think we need a substantial rise to make up some of what we have lost. But we are consulting our reps and our members because we want to make sure that people have confidence in that claim. You know, some people think, well, 10%, maybe that's a little bit large. Others said to us last year, it's important we claim far more. So we want to get the claim right, and we want people to tell us their views. But we're also consulting people on the type of action that we would take in a ballot, what type of ballot it should be, and who we should ballot. They're all key questions, and I'm sure you'll want me to develop each of those more. But the key thing is we want everybody's views on all aspects of the campaign to ensure that we get it absolutely right.
Can you elaborate a bit on when you say who's in the ballot? What do we mean by that? What are we consulting on there?
So last year when we balloted all of our members in the public sector. Yeah. That's the core civil service, that's people in the devolved administrations, it's people in non-departmental public bodies, the museums, the galleries, places like the Metropolitan Police. This year the NEC's view is, having looked last year at the turnout and having looked at the issues that arose in the campaign, we think that the central ballot should be a ballot of the UK civil service. And we think that to do that gives us a clear message, it gives us a very clear bargaining unit to go to the Cabinet Office, i.e. all UK civil servants, But we want to check with people that people agree with that. And we know that in some parts of the union, it's a grey area whether people class themselves as in the civil service or not. So we want to make sure that we get that right. But in asking people whether they agree it's a UK civil service-wide ballot, we're also clear that for everyone else, we want to encourage simultaneous ballots in different parts of the union to give people the best chance to trigger their own dispute with their employer at the same time as we're balloting all UK civil servants. And the last thing I'll say, just to explain to people about why this is important, is last year we had some big employers. One of them had over 5,000 PCS members in it. They weren't in the civil service, and their managers and their political leaders managed to sow enough confusion with the workforce that they weren't civil servants, so the ballot had nothing to do with them, that their turnout was particularly low. And of course that undermined the whole national ballot. So we've learnt from last year, we want to give ourselves the best chance of winning, and that's why we think it should be UK civil service wide with separate ballots in other areas.
Okay, thank you. Can I just remind people to keep liking and sharing the event? That'd be helpful, thank you. On the subject of the type of ballot, Mark, there have been some suggestions that it should be a disaggregated ballot, in the same way that the UCU carried that sort of ballot last year. Why does the NEC not think that's an option for PCS?
Well, I'm glad this question's come up, and I think it's very important that people understand why the NEC thinks we need one national ballot. So first of all, let me explain for any member who's watching who may not understand the technicalities. The NEC wants to ballot all UK civil servants in one ballot and declare one result. A disaggregate ballot is where you have separate ballots in different civil service departments. Those who win would be able to take action, and those who lose wouldn't, and that's what the UCU did. Now, the reason we strongly believe we need a national ballot is for this simple reason. Our dispute is with the government. It's not with individual departmental employers. It is only the government and the Treasury that can release the funds to fund a 10% pay claim. And therefore, if your dispute's with the government, it must follow. You need the biggest ballot and the biggest turnout of everybody as possible. And secondly, we believe that if you have an employer-by-employer ballot, there is a real risk there of divide and rule. It would mean, for example, that areas where we were slightly less well organised, they wouldn't be able to take action, which means that basically those areas would just have to accept what the employer gave them. But it would also mean that we'd be very vulnerable to an age-old divide and rule tactic. Because if we go employer by employer, if we do really well in one area, that employer may seek to buy people off by offering a little bit of a divisive element to the pay, which means the unity that we've got would actually be fractured. So we think we should be confident. We must remember that last year we had the best turnout in the history of this union. 86% of people voted for a strike. And based on that, now's the time to say the disputes with the government, one ballot is the best way, and to do anything less really risks being divided and lose.
Okay, thank you. And can you update us on whether we're in talks with the employer currently?
Well, this has been a bit frustrating. I have to say, probably like anybody watching this, we're probably all Brexited out. It means that, whatever the question, the answer is Brexit. And obviously the problem with that has been much of the day-to-day stuff that we would be wanting to talk to the government about. Pensions, redundancy scheme and everything else, austerity, a new welfare system. It's very difficult to get anyone to engage on that at the moment because of the national obsession that is Brexit. So we haven't had the talks to date that we would have wanted. It's not through lack of effort. We've written lots of letters, we've made phone calls. But I am now finally pleased to report that we do have a meeting on the 1st of February, and that'll be a meeting with myself and the General Secretaries of Prospect and the FDA, which is good news because that's the three big civil service unions in unity. And we're meeting the new Cabinet Secretary and the Chief Executive of the Civil Service. And this is an important meeting because it's on the back of last year's legal challenge, and it's the three unions saying we're not prepared to go through what we went through last year. And let me just remind people that uniquely our members were betrayed last year by their senior leaders, because while other public sector senior management were making the case to the Treasury to give them more money to pay their workforce, ours did what is probably one of the most shocking things I think we've ever seen. Is they were told that they could have up to 2%, and they voted and decided to have less. In other words, the way that your permanent secretaries rewarded you last year, when you probably worked harder than for many a year, was to not even give you what they could have given you from the Treasury. Now that is a betrayal that cannot stand. We challenged it in court last year, we weren't successful, but the court case did reveal this monumental betrayal. So this meeting on the 1st of February is where the three unions will be in unity, saying we're not prepared to put up with that this year, and we will report back on that meeting to members and to a special meeting of the executive on the 5th of February, where we're also hoping to have had all the consultation responses in, and that's when we aim to make a decision moving forward on, hopefully, if we haven't made any progress, moving to a ballot, or if we have made progress, reporting that back to members and engaging with the employer.
Okay, thank you. Mark, we lost the ballot last year. I think it was Einstein that said, wasn't it, that you don't keep doing the same thing over and over again, or the definition of madness is to do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. So what can we do differently this time to win?
Well, I think it is important that we learn the lessons from last year. And I think to start with, I think we've got to remember we delivered the best turnout in the union's history. So we had an 86% vote to strike, which we have never had in PCS. And anyone who's been a PCS member over the last 10 or 20 years will know that we often had votes that were 60, 65, 66%. So the majority for action was unprecedented. We also had the biggest turnout in the union's history, just shy of 42%. And so we did incredibly well last year. But the laws don't allow us to take action. So what we've done is we've analysed the votes. We've listened very carefully to what members and reps told us. We fine-tuned a lot of the detail. So this year, for example, when we do our phone banking of members, we're going to be able to involve hundreds of people from any location. So we'll have far more people doing phone calls. We've adjusted the strategy so that we're proposing a UK civil service ballot, because last year, although we didn't get over 50% in a lot of government departments, we did in some. And we actually think we don't have to do that much better in order to get over the 50% threshold. And of course, last year we did well, but since that, members now know they were betrayed. Uniquely, they were betrayed. They could have had a higher pay rise last year if it hadn't been for the permanent secretaries. And we're hoping that anger, with a new focus on listening to what members have told us, with the government weaker now than it's ever been, we can not just sneak over the 50%. Our aim and objective is to sail through the 50% threshold with a massive majority for action, because that gives us the most leverage to demand they talk to us and start making concessions. And we genuinely think that is not just repeating what we did last year, that's making changes in a new circumstance, and we can win.
Okay, thank you. So why is it a postal ballot? I know we had a lot of complaints about it just being postal last year. Can you explain a bit about that?
Yes, I know this is very frustrating, and lots of members of our union, of course, are new to the union, and they won't realise that back in the 1980s, the Conservative government decided that they wanted to stop strikes, so they introduced this law that said you can now only vote by post. We used to vote in a workplace, so where people could vote in a ballot box, and we used to have huge turnouts. Now, since the 80s, the government has used postal balloting to try and make it hard for people to vote. And then a number of years ago, they then increased that massively by then introducing this 50% of people have to vote. So it's the law of the land. It's completely and utterly undemocratic because, of course, you don't have to just vote by post in a general election. Most people, if they've got a bank account, will be allowed to vote for the shareholders by post. You can vote online. You know, our big departments, they have a digital by default strategy. So it seems to be good enough for anyone to do anything these days, by person or online, unless you want to vote for a strike. But that is the law. Now, I can say to people, we've met Britain's most eminent lawyers in terms of workforce laws and rights. And we are now likely to try to go to the International Labour Organization to get an international legal ruling that this curtails people's legal rights. And we are likely to take further legal action. But it's not going to happen. These things can take years. So we're not just going to stand by and accept it, but what I think we do have to accept is a ballot in the next 2 months is going to be under the postal. And that is why I want to just urge people now, so I don't forget, that make sure that you register your up-to-date details. Last year we found that lots of members never got ballot papers because they'd moved house, or they had it to a workplace address and the workplace had changed and they never contacted us. And of course, what we found is many people were coming to us too late to get replacement ballot papers. So this year I can say that there'll be a big push before any ballot to make sure we've got everybody's up-to-date emails and workplace addresses or home addresses. But we will also focus our telephone banking in this campaign in the first week of the ballot to ensure that we get as many people as we can. We contact you by phone. So if for some reason you haven't received your ballot paper, it's early enough for you to get a replacement. So we're going to try and learn from last year. We're making a few adjustments to how any ballot would be run, but it's the law of the land. And so what I could say to people is make sure you get a ballot paper, make sure you post it back straight away, because if we get over 50%, then we're in a position to try and do something about people's pay.
Okay, thank you. And if we win that ballot and move to industrial action, what would that look like?
Well, the first thing to say is that as per last year, the NEC is not proposing that we have a ballot and then just have a one-day strike. We know that people are fed up with what they saw as a protest, that our ballot is about serious, sustained action to put pressure on the government. And the question that we will put to members is that we're asking people to vote for a combination of all members taking action together, but then targeted, sustained action designed to hit the government where it hurts. And that means going to the areas where we can bring members out, pay them strike pay, and ask them to stay out to cause as much disruption as possible. Now, the first thing to remind people of is that since we balloted last year, we've beaten the government in the High Court, received a substantial compensation package for their unlawful action against the union. And the NEC has immediately put £1 million into the fighting fund. So we already have £1 million ready to pay out in strike pay to members who take action. And we're also asking members to agree a very modest 50p increase in subscriptions that we will ring fence and immediately only put in to pay people strike pay. And if we do that, then that is also going to raise a further £1 million a year, which will raise over £100,000 a month. So we are really saying that we will now have the finance to target action in addition to asking all members to come out. And every group of the union is meeting in the next 2 weeks, and we're asking them, where can we deliver significant action that will really hurt? And my message to people really is, we know the government at the moment are asking civil servants all over the place to volunteer to stop doing their normal job and do Brexit work. We know that we could leave with no deal, which could be chaotic. We could leave with a government, some form of deal. What we know is, in any circumstance, the government needs civil servants more than ever before. So they are uniquely vulnerable to our action. And that's why I really want to get across. We're not voting to protest. We're voting to cause the government as much problems as we can in as many high-profile areas as we can, not for the sake of it, but because anyone watching this deserves a 10% pay rise. And the government aren't likely to give it unless they think we can put enough pressure on them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so keep questions coming in. We've got loads. There's been quite a few that have emailed in and quite a few that have sent them through Facebook Live. So I'll try and cover a range of those. Sandy from London said, I've just moved to Yorkshire from London. My pay has been reduced by £3,000. The cost of living is just as expensive to live up here as it is in London, apart from the rent. And I would like to see more fairness with regards to that. What are your thoughts?
Well, first and foremost, our thought is wherever you live, you deserve a 10% pay rise. I mean, that's the first thing to get across, that everybody deserves 10%. That's because you've lost more than 10% because of what the government has done, and it's time that people saw a real rise in their wages. Now, historically, across not just the public sector, but across the private sector, it's been recognised now for decades that there are some unique financial pressures on people living in London. Whether that's the cost of transport, the cost of housing, there's a whole variety of issues, the cost of the council tax, that historically has always been a premium for London. And our view here is until we ever sort out a decent economy and decent pay for everybody, we have to ensure that our 10% pay rise is 10% for everybody. And at the moment, if that means there's a London pay premium, we believe they need a 10% pay rise as much as everybody else. And that's the basis of our case. But let's be clear, we've always understood that there are places in this country outside of London where there are significant cost pressures. York may well be one. I know there are other parts of the country where there is an economy that forces up prices that our members can't afford in. So, the message for us really is we shouldn't be divided. You deserve 10% wherever you live, and that's what we want to get for people.
Okay, thank you. And Stuart asks, what can we do about those members who just couldn't be bothered to vote last time, therefore denying the large majority of those of us who did vote the opportunity to take some action? If it was down to me, they'd have their membership cancelled.
Okay, well, I think that question from Stuart actually gives away an underlying anger, which I understand entirely. If 86% of people vote for a strike and the government impose laws that they don't afford on anybody else, you're bound to be angry. First and foremost, I think we have to direct that anger at the government. The laws should be repealed and people should have a fundamental right to strike. But secondly, Stuart does raise a point because, of course, what the ballot tells us is 58% of people didn't vote last year. And any union should be concerned when 58% of people don't vote. Now, I think there's a variety of reasons. I have no doubt we had many members who didn't receive ballot papers, many members who did not vote for practical reasons. But clearly, there was a very large percentage who chose not to vote. And we have got to engage with those people. We have got to get across. And I'm going to say something here that maybe we should have said louder last time round, which is more important that people vote, even if they're going to vote no. Because the irony of the ballot last year was if 12,000 people had voted no, we'd have had a legal strike and we still would have had an over 70% majority. So actually people not voting, that abstention, is in reality a no vote. And I think that's the message we've got to get across, that it's your union, we want you to vote and tell us what you think. And the best way to engage with that, I think, is we at the centre will send out a lot of emails, a lot of leaflets, and we will constantly encourage people to vote. But the best way to engage, I think, is other members of the union trying to persuade their colleagues to vote, more people becoming volunteers or advocates for the union, and just get across this simple message, really, that for every person who doesn't bother to vote, Theresa May and Philip Hammond are the ones who are smiling, and because they're sitting back and they're actually interpreting that as apathy.
Yeah.
And I think what we've got across is now's not the time for apathy. Now is the time to say, you're a union member, have your say. I hope you vote yes, but more than anything, I hope people vote. Because if we don't beat the threshold this time, the government will be the ones who believe that they can just sit back and carry on treating people. So let's all do everything we can to persuade every person to fill in their ballot paper and send it back.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, Helen's got a question next. What about office closures? You expect us to fight for pay, but for all the people who face losing their jobs, what would be the point of a pay rise if you don't have a job? My future is so uncertain when we move to the regional centres, purely because I'm disabled and may not be able to travel. How is that fair? So.
Well, it's not fair. Let's start with that. It's not fair. I mean, and I'm guessing here we're talking about an HMRC member, but obviously there are other government departments having closures. And let's be clear, the government's estate strategy is appalling. They are withdrawing from local communities. They are removing public sector employment from parts of the country that, going back in the post-war period, all political parties recognised the need for the civil service to be in all parts of the UK. So it's the government's decisions that are unfair and they're shocking. But of course, as a union, it doesn't mean that we can only do one thing at a time. What is the reason to fight for pay is because whether your office is under threat, whether you're new, whether you've been here for 15, 20 years, we all have an interest in everybody being paid a fair wage. The reality is that all increases on pay will feed into people's pensions, it will feed into people's compensation packages in the event that they leave the civil service. So all of us should ensure we have decent pay. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't oppose office closures. And the NEC, and I would want to repeat this point, is clear that if any office or any branch of the union or group of the union wants to fight their office closure and is looking for support from the national union, we will support it. Yeah. In fact, I can say that we are just receiving our first submission for industrial action from an office in HMRC who wishes to ballot against their office closure. I have no doubt that submission will be supported. So we can do more than one thing at a time. In fact, as 2019 unrolls, we know there will be issues around redundancy pay, pensions pay, office closures. All of them are unjust. But I would make this observation that if we win a ballot on pay and we win a pay rise, it puts us in a stronger position to be confident we can fight more office closures. So I feel very sorry for the person who asked this question, and I feel very sorry for any member who feels they've been put in this type of position. The answer has to be the union should oppose the office closures but fight for fair pay as well.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of questions which I'm going to wrap up together around the DWP employee deal next, obviously subject close to my heart. The first one from Michelle. What about those who didn't take the employee deal as it wasn't for them? I've worked for 41 years, have a wealth of experience and now earn less than somebody who's brought in today to gather. What is the union doing for me? My hourly rate is not much less than the minimum wage, but I'm dealing with people's lives. And Bev Laidlaw, also from the DWP, said, what would happen to those in DWP who opted out of the employee deal? Bit like Michelle, and can this only be 0.25%? So I'm happy to answer that, or happy for you to.
So I'll just say what I think, but I think it would be useful if you could add to it. Look, my view is what we're doing here is trying to get everybody a 10% pay rise. I mean, that's the first thing to remind ourselves. Whatever has been before, we want everybody to have a 10% pay rise, and we want the government to have to give the funding that allows us to negotiate that at the centre. And so that is now the best way for everybody to unite, whether people opted in or didn't. What we need now is an across-the-board pay rise for everybody. The other thing I would say is just to remind ourselves also that when we did the DWP employee deal, which of course was voted for by an overwhelming majority of members, we did it when the government had a rigid public sector pay cap applied across everywhere. Now we've got to remind ourselves all the time, they don't have that rigid pay cap. Now we are in a position to try and fight for pay rises for everybody, and that is what we want to do.
Okay, and I mean, along the same lines, Patricia Barnes has also messaged to say, what happens when an employee deal finishes? Will those not in the deal have their pay brought in line with everyone else? Will they always be left behind? Even with a 10% pay rise, we would still be underpaid. And you know, just to answer that, it's obviously a 4-year deal. It ends in 2020, and the job of the incoming government will be to talk to DWP and for DWP to talk to us about what happens next in DWP. But I think the message has to be that it's never been more important for DWP members to be part of this campaign, because the only way of getting those issues addressed is by breaking the cap, because it's the cap that prevents the DWP from being able to do anything other than what it is doing for members, whether they opted in or opted out. So I think it's a good question, but it's clearly an issue that affects those who, whether you opted in or not. It's important that we're all part of this campaign, because this campaign is about changing pay across the civil service.
And I think it's also important to remind people that because sometimes we all get lost, particularly who've been around for ages, about the intricacies of this, that and the other. But the simple way I would ask members to take this on board is this, that we need a bigger cake. If the cake is 10% bigger, i.e. the Treasury has to give an extra 10% everywhere, it's clear from that everybody benefits. The problem has been in the civil service for years is it's been a tiny cake with very rigid caps, and therefore people have done really, really badly. And the way I would look at it, for wherever you work, whatever you've previously agreed or not agreed, if we are successful in getting the Treasury to have to fund a 10% increase, everybody must benefit. And I think that's the starting point that we need to get everybody to think about. Less about which department you're in. What may have happened before is just about simply ask yourself the question, if we suddenly had 10% more, everybody would benefit. And that's why, if we stick together, we have a chance, hence why we want a national ballot. Comes back to an earlier question. If we divide up into different groups, what will happen is everybody will just focus on their own particular issues, and the government won't be forced with a national campaign that it has to put more money in.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of questions here that relate to the ballot. Both David Lamb and Annette Wright ask, are figures available breaking down the turnout in the ballot by branch? And Annette says, why can't we have a ballot where we're allowed to know the results for each group? So it's very much about the data that's available to reps and to the union.
Yeah, so in just to confirm, in the ballot last time, we did not have branch by branch breakdown. What we did have is the breakdown by branch of where members told us they had voted, and we've given that to branches. And I think, as we explained last time round, when we analysed the figures, you could actually see, I think it was about 2 in every 3 members who'd voted actually told us that they had voted. So having those figures gives us something to work on. We did know the result and did internally give to groups the ballot data that they had as a group. Yes. And again, this time we will be constructing the ballot with the view of being able to give the maximum information that we can. But I think what we've got to remember here is, in a national aggregate ballot, if we win that ballot, the last thing we want is that the employer knowing group by group how that was, because of course that would open us to potentially a legal challenge, but more significantly it would tell the employer where we were strong and where we were weak, and that's not something particularly we want the employer to know. We have a belief that the union is strongest if we're united, and if we get a national ballot result, that's the ability for us to show our strongest hand.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Sorry?
Yeah. Okay, I think we've had a few technical difficulties, but we're back. I'm just going to recap the last question, which was from Julie, who asked, to be honest, I'm beginning to wonder why I'm paying for PCS. The government just don't care. There's too much wrong for them to fix. I've emailed the MP, not that it will do any good. People can't afford to go on strike. How do you expect the government to listen to our needs when they have Brexit to sort out? We are nothing in the scheme of things, and it is so demotivating. And Dil Joshi asks, how can we convince our members to take strike action? So, a bit of demotivation there, and whether we've got any tips about how we can encourage members to that it is worth taking strike action.
Well, certainly on the first question, the worst thing anyone could do would be to leave PCS, because if people are not in the union, then the government certainly won't listen to anyone. And we're trying to convince them that we're speaking for the majority of the workforce. So I do understand how frustrating it is. And I did say earlier on in the broadcast that, a lot of people think people are just obsessed with Brexit. But I think what we have to do is turn that around and actually say what is about to become clear is the government depend on you. They will depend on people over the next few months more than they have ever done before, and we've got to use that to our advantage. So we can't let the argument run. The government's got a problem with Brexit, so now is the time for us all to not say anything. I think we have to do the opposite, actually, and say what Brexit will show is they need civil servants. They need people in the Rural Payments Agency and at the ports and at the airports and administering the universal credit and keeping our justice system running. They need us more than ever before, and now's the time for them to pay us properly. In terms of the question about how to motivate people, look, all we've got to do here, I think, is understand one simple truism, that people always look to a union, I think, if they think the union is trying to stand up for them. We are trying to stand up, and we've got to now get that message across in every workplace. Events like this help. We've now got more than 75% of people with their personal email addresses, so we're going to communicate. But the thing that matters more than anything is whether there's somebody in your office who's a union rep or an advocate, somebody who's on the ground able to chat to people. And I think that what we want really, now more than ever, is more people to volunteer, to say, do you know what, for the pay campaign, I'm prepared for PCS to contact me and I'm prepared to talk to my colleagues at work. Because we have got to get a simple message across. Without us, the country would grind to a halt, and the government certainly would grind to a halt. Now more than ever, that is true. So now more than ever, we have to show them they can't take us for granted. And this pay campaign gives us a real opportunity to show them that.
Okay, thank you. Along the same, sticking with Brexit, we're already stretched beyond capacity, Ali says. How are we expected to also deliver Brexit? It's really a question about targeted action. Look at the effect a drone sighting had on the airports recently. Surely if we want to win, we should pay our members in the ports and airports to come out and strike.
Well, that's an excellent question. Yeah. And obviously, as we've already said here, our strategy is to win the ballot, show the government that everybody feels strongly. So we do want all members to take action, but we are focusing on where we can cause that real disruption. Now, of course, what we have to be able to do is ensure the members in the ports and airports and the universal credits, all the areas that really matter, actually are prepared to take action on behalf of everybody else. So I can say to you now, we're talking to reps, we're talking to the elected officials in all the groups to ensure that we can pull that action off. And believe me, with Brexit, the question is quite right, they are vulnerable all over the place. So this is not a campaign like we ran 10 years ago where people sought to have a one-day strike. What we are trying to do is win the ballot first and foremost, then take the action that the government can't ignore. And as the question points out, there's a lot of speculation, but we've ourselves given evidence to Parliament that if there's a no-deal Brexit, there is the potential to see traffic jams on our motorway networks that could be 40, 50, 60 miles long. Yeah. There could be chaos in areas. Well, that's even if everybody's at work doing their best. But if we're having industrial action where people are withdrawing cooperation and taking action, that disruption could be much, much bigger. So we are talking to people now as we speak to put together a strategy like that if members vote for it.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Andy from the police says, this is about time that we took some action. Can we not organise a march in London like the police did some years ago? A strike action does not always resonate well with the public. We want their support, not negative comments, because they do not receive their benefits on time. Let's be smarter than the government spin doctors. As the police marches grew in numbers, the Home Office backed down. So clearly, whether there are other forms of action that could be taken, I suppose.
Yeah, and of course there's lots of forms of action. Yeah. And the NEC is already planning for a big lobby of Parliament early in March that we will be advising people of nearer the date, and we're hoping that that's going to have a lot of people into London to come and be part of that. And certainly as the campaign goes on, I think we would want to see a lot of public sort of demonstration of our strength. When we win the ballot, if a ballot is what we will have to take, then that ballot is live for 6 months. And I can assure you what the NEC will want to do is a whole variety of different tactics. But I think, as has been shown in the past, marches on their own are not enough. And marches are important, and I think we may well see a big march. But what we know is we need to do more than that. And I think, first and foremost, members need to give us the legal mandate to call disruptive industrial action, if that is what it takes. And what we will do armed with that mandate is try to show as large in a way as possible the support that we actually have. But we have to win the ballot first.
Yeah. Okay. A couple of questions here. One from Karen about the Fighting Fund. Why should I contribute to the Fighting Fund while I already give you money through my subs? And one from Richard Pridmore, who says, many people I work with aren't in the union. Raising the fees isn't going to help bring in new members. If you lowered them, perhaps most people would sign. So, related questions about union subs and building.
Yes, and look, I think we understand that we have a very low paid membership, and people are really struggling to make ends meet, which is why we need a pay rise. PCS's union subscriptions are some of the lowest that there are in the trade union movement, and what we're trying to say here is that we're proposing a very modest increase, 50p, but that increase can only go into the strike fund and will be used to pay people strike pay who would be taking action on everybody's behalf. So what it's going to give us is the ability to call the action and pay people, but we need to raise money to actually do that. And given a lot of our members have asked questions tonight about targeted action, we actually are proposing here that if people pay 50p a month, and that allows us to call the type of action that gets the government to the negotiating table, then that would have been a very worthwhile, cost-effective thing to actually do. So it's a part of the tactic that we put forward. But clearly, we're hoping that members will accept that if that's what the money is used for, that's 50p that is well spent. And I can assure people that every penny will only be used and will be publicly accounted and demonstrated to members to pay people to take industrial action. And if we do that, we'll potentially be stronger than we have been for many a year.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of questions that make reference to the recent FBU challenge. Marcus from the courts says, the FBU successfully beat the government in the courts on pensions. Could PCS take similar legal action over pay? And Linda said, can PCS outline what their next steps will be following the successful challenge by the FBU on the changes to pensions in 2015? Pensions are very much linked to pay, and for some members will be the only source of pay next year. So the question of action to restore Classic rights to those of us who were kicked out of Classic in 2015 is extremely important, given that we may retire in the next 5 years. So clearly the FBU result has had a bearing, and people are asking us what thoughts on that.
Yeah, they're very good questions. And just to take the first part of the first question, we obviously did take legal action on pay after the campaign last year, and that wasn't successful. And what it actually showed us is that our legal ability to fight for pay is very restricted, because the government, amazingly, does not have collective bargaining with its own workforce. So there's no quick legal route. The best and most effective route on pay would be to show them that members are prepared to take action. The FBU pensions victory is a very significant victory, and of course it reminds us that we won our own massive victory in the courts recently on redundancy scheme, one that is still in place, that has cost the government over nearly £200 million and has been money in our members' pockets. So the FBU pensions victory is particularly welcome, because the court has found that they discriminated against people under 50. And we are liaising with the FBU and looking very carefully at the ramifications of that legal action. Now, at the moment, there's a number of uncertainties about an appeal to the Supreme Court, what the remedy is going to be now that the FBU have won. And therefore, we need and are taking urgent legal advice to check on the ramifications, how they would sit across to PCS members. But what I can assure people is that if this throws up opportunities for us, either legally or on the negotiating table on the back of that victory, we will be seeking to maximise that for our members. And therefore we show absolute solidarity to the FBU, and we will be studying the ramifications of that very closely. That's probably also, I think, a good point to remind people that that's one aspect of pensions. There's another aspect of pensions that's going to become very live this year, which is that the government is now legally obliged to put money in to pension schemes because they didn't cost as much as they were expecting, and we will be in negotiations shortly on how we can right that wrong. So it's going to be a big year for pensions, potentially for redundancy, and all of these things. I'd really finish with this thought, that we're going to be in a better position on pensions and redundancy if we've won on pay. It must follow that if we have a ballot on pay and we don't quite do it, that the union's in a weaker position. So there's a common theme here. The government will take notice to a strong union. We have the ability to show them we're strong in this ballot, and they already know, because we've beaten them 5 times in the High Court in the last few years, that we will pursue them in the courts. And if the FBU victory allows us to do that on pensions, absolutely, I'm sure the NEC will do that.
Okay, thank you. I mean, a couple of very positive comments that have come in. Malcolm Davies says, I believe it's down to every rep to ensure their own workplaces are organised to the max. And Malcolm, we couldn't agree more. So clearly that's something that we'll be taking very seriously and trying to make sure that has a rep in every workplace, and that those workplaces are well organised as they can be, and that obviously gives us the best chance of success. And Sukhbir says, I agree with you about pay. I've been overworked and underpaid. I've been working for my department for over 30 years. My pay is less now than even new recruits. It's shameful that how we are treated in the civil service, and it's a penalty for being committed and for our loyalty. And I think that's a sentiment that probably a number of us would agree with.
And I think it is probably worth saying here that our case is just. We did this last year. We had an incredibly impressive result, but it fell short of the new legal thresholds, and therefore we have to now learn from that. And the key thing is an active union at workplace level, and one that members get involved in. So, at the moment, I think it's worth reminding people we're having a big consultation this month. So there are 29 briefing sessions going on. NEC members are out and about in January. I myself am doing big meetings next week in Birmingham, in Liverpool, in Newcastle. Other people are doing the same. So find out and attend your meeting. Fill in your online survey that's gone out by email. If you're a rep, send back your response from your branch. Get involved so that when we meet in February, if we push the button on a ballot, that we are better placed than we were this time last year to actually win. And I think that's the real key thing here, that all the questions tonight, whatever people have said, Nobody disputes that we're paid badly. We are taken for granted by the government and we deserve better. We are going to try to persuade them at the meeting on the 1st of February. We are going to look at all of our options. But I think if we're honest, I think we know one thing to be true, that it is almost certain that they will want to see the colour of our money, and they will want to see, can we do this year what we didn't quite manage last year? And I think it's as simple as this really. The more people who get involved, the bigger the ballot result, the better chance we've got of getting real progress on pay. If we don't beat the threshold, then unfortunately we're in a weaker position. So I hope people get involved in PCS, do all the things that we've asked, but most importantly, if you get a questionnaire or a ballot paper, fill it in, because together we can win. Yeah.
Okay, well look, just in closing, there's obviously not been time to take everybody's questions, but there have been some excellent questions raised and quite an array from across the different departments, which gives us a lot of hope around all of this. Both Vince and Dill have said that they would really like to see action alongside the other unions, alongside the FDA and Prospect. So clearly the meeting on the 1st of Feb will be important, and if we can encourage other unions to come on board, that's got to strengthen our arguments. I would urge everyone to take part in the consultation, because clearly we want as wide a range of views as possible fed into that, and we want a fairly clear steer to the NEC around what people are saying. Make sure that your own details are up to date, because as Mark says, you know, when we do come to ballot, we've made great strides in improving the accuracy of our data, but it could always be better. So you do need to check that the ballot paper is going to the right place for you, and get involved. The more members we have involved, the better. You know, one of the things we've learned in recent discussions and in the previous ballot was that the more people that are taking part in this, the more likely we are to win. I also, just before closing, want to send solidarity to our PCS members that are on strike tomorrow morning. They're working in the outsourced companies within BEIS, B-E-I-S, and clearly we want to wish them well for a successful strike in their action that they're taking tomorrow. So thanks ever so much for joining us. No doubt there'll be more of this, and keep the questions coming, because we'll make sure we get answers to as many as possible. Thank you.